She would later tell herself that the first lie wasn't his name, or the worn coat, or even the way he let the whole town believe he had nothing. It was the way he looked at her like a man with nowhere else to go, when in truth he had everything to return to, and simply chose not to. And Clara Whitlow did not know any of that on the day she stepped off the train in Red Mesa wearing a widow's black dress and carrying a future that unraveled before it ever began. The letter had promised her a man named Silas Boone, steady, practical, and in need of a wife who understood that the land did not give easily, but rewarded those who stayed. And Clara had read those words enough times to believe not just in the man, but in the life that seemed to sit just beyond the next mile of track, waiting for her to arrive and claim it. Silas Boone was not at the station. He was not at the general store, not at the livery, not at any of the places where a man expecting his bride might reasonably be found. And Clara stood on the platform with her single trunk and her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her, as though patience alone might correct the situation if she held it long enough. An hour passed, then another, and the station clerk, who had the careful tone of someone accustomed to delivering disappointments without becoming part of them, finally told her that Silas Boone had left Red Mesa nearly a month ago. No explanation given, no message left behind, and certainly no instruction regarding the woman he had summoned across half a country with promises written in steady, convincing ink. Clara did not cry. She had buried a husband at 22 and learned then that grief, when offered in public, rarely found the kind of understanding it deserved. And so she simply nodded, thanked the clerk as though he had done her a kindness, and picked up her trunk with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through worse. Red Mesa was not the sort of town that asked questions, which suited her well enough, and by the time the sun had shifted westward, she had found work at a boarding house that leaned slightly to one side and held together more by habit than by structure, run by a woman named Martha Klein, who saw Clara's situation in a single glance and offered her a room, meals, and a modest wage in exchange for work that began before dawn and ended only when the last lamp was turned down. Clara accepted without hesitation. She had arrived with little more than hope, and hope, she was discovering, was not a currency that could be spent twice. Weeks passed in a rhythm that required no reflection to sustain it, and Clara learned the house in the way a person learns survival, thoroughly, without complaint, and with an attention to detail that left little room for anything else. She knew which guest preferred silence and which required conversation to feel at ease, which floorboards warned of approaching footsteps and which betrayed nothing at all, and she told herself, on most days, that this was enough, that a life built quietly was still a life worth keeping, even if it bore no resemblance to the one she had once imagined. It was near the end of October, when the air had taken on that thin, brittle edge that comes just before the first hard frost, that the cowboy was brought in. 2 men carried him through the front door, just as Clara was clearing the supper table, his boots dragging against the floorboards in a way that spoke of real injury rather than drink, and the sight of the dark stains spreading through his shirt along one shoulder told her immediately that whatever had happened to him had not been minor or accidental. They said they found him outside town, near the dry creek bed, barely conscious and alone, and then they left as quickly as they had come, as though involvement beyond that point was a responsibility they had no interest in claiming. Martha gave a single nod toward the back room, and Clara moved without being asked, because there are moments when a person recognizes what needs to be done without waiting for instruction. She had no formal training, but she had experience, and experience had taught her that hesitation often did more harm than ignorance ever could. The wound was a gunshot, clean but deep, and whoever had wrapped it before had done so hastily, more concerned with stopping blood than preventing what might follow. And Clara worked with steady hands, cleaning and binding, aware of the man's silence in a way that felt different from the usual complaints or bravado she had come to expect from injured men. He did not flinch. He did not speak until she finished, and when he did, his voice was low and even, as though pain was simply a fact to be acknowledged rather than resisted. "You didn't have to do that," he said, and Clara, rinsing her hands in the basin, replied without turning, "Yes, I did." Because some things were not about obligation, but about the kind of person one chose to be when no one was watching closely enough to form an opinion. He gave his name as Eli Carter, and it settled into the room with a simplicity that did not invite further questions, though Clara noticed, in a quiet and unformed way, that it did not entirely fit him. Over the next few days, he remained in that back room, healing with a patience that suggested familiarity with injury, speaking little but observing much, and Clara found herself aware of him in the same way one becomes aware of a change in weather, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. He watched her when she worked, not in a way that felt intrusive, but with a kind of deliberate attention that suggested he was measuring something. Though what that something might be, she could not have said. On the fourth morning, he was sitting up when she entered, the light from the window catching in his eyes in a way that made them appear lighter than they had the day before, and he said, without preamble, "You're not from here." And Clara, adjusting the bandage at his shoulder, answered simply, "No," because explanations had long since lost their usefulness in a town that did not ask for them. He nodded, as though confirming something he had already suspected, and for a moment, the room held a quiet that felt less like absence and more like the beginning of something not yet named. Clara did not trust beginnings. She had learned, more than once, that they often arrived dressed as something they were not, and yet, as she stepped back into the hallway and closed the door behind her, she found herself pausing, her hand resting briefly against the worn wood, aware in a way she had not been since stepping off that train that something in her carefully managed world had shifted, not dramatically, not enough to disturb the order she had built, but just enough to suggest that the story she thought had already been written might still have a few pages left to turn. The trouble with a man who claims to have nothing is not that he might be lying, Clara would come to understand, but that he often knows exactly how much everything is worth, and Eli Carter, if that was his name, carried himself like someone who had measured the world carefully and decided to step outside of it, at least for a time, which made his presence in Martha Klein's boarding house feel less like coincidence and more like a choice whose reason had not yet been offered. By the end of the first week, he was on his feet, moving carefully but with a steadiness that suggested the wound had taken less from him than it might have from another man, and he began, without announcement, to make himself useful in small, deliberate ways that drew little attention but did not go unnoticed by Clara, who had developed a habit of seeing what others overlooked. He carried water without being asked, split wood with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, and repaired a loose hinge on the back gate using tools he seemed to know how to handle better than most of the men who passed through Red Mesa claiming to be ranch hands or cowboys, and yet he never once mentioned where he had learned any of it. When Martha offered to reduce his board in exchange for the work, he accepted with a simple nod, as though the arrangement suited him precisely as it was, neither more nor less than he required. Clara watched him the way she watched everything, with quiet attention and without intrusion, and what she noticed was not any single inconsistency, but the accumulation of small details that did not quite align with the life he described. He spoke plainly, but rarely of himself, and when he did, his words held a careful quality, as though each one had been considered before being allowed to exist, and she recognized that kind of speech not as deceit, but as restraint, the kind practiced by someone who understood the consequences of saying too much. It was on a cool afternoon, the kind that carried the first real promise of winter, that the first crack appeared in the story he had constructed. Clara was in the front room, mending a tear in one of the curtains, when the door opened without ceremony and a man stepped inside who did not belong to Red Mesa, not by dress, not by bearing, and certainly not by the way he looked around the room with the expectation of finding exactly what he had come for. He was well-made, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and when his eyes landed on Eli, who was seated by the window with a newspaper folded neatly in his hands, something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition followed by something like relief. "Thought I might find you here," the man said, his voice low but carrying, and Eli lowered the paper slowly, meeting his gaze without any visible change in demeanor, though Clara, watching from across the room, felt the air tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "You've been looking," Eli replied, and it was not a question. The man stepped further into the room, removing his gloves with deliberate care, as though he had no intention of leaving quickly. "Your father's partners are getting impatient," he said. "You disappearing like this hasn't made things easier." Clara's hands had gone still in her lap, the needle suspended midair, and though she kept her eyes lowered, every part of her attention had turned toward the quiet exchange unfolding only a few feet away. Eli did not respond immediately, and when he did, his voice remained even, almost conversational, as though they were discussing something of no real consequence. "That sounds like their concern," he said. The man exhaled, a hint of frustration breaking through his composure. "It becomes yours when they start making decisions without you," he said. "There's land, Carter, more than most men see in a lifetime, and your name is still tied to it whether you like it or not." The word land settled into Clara's thoughts with a weight she could not immediately place, and she felt, rather than saw, the shift in Eli's posture, subtle but unmistakable, as though something long held in check had just been acknowledged. "I told them I was out," Eli said, and for the first time, there was a trace of something sharper beneath the calm. "You don't get to be out," the man replied. "Not from this. Not from what you are." A silence followed, the kind that fills a room completely, leaving no space for anything else, and Clara understood, without needing further explanation, that the man she had been tending for the past week was not what he had claimed to be. The stranger glanced briefly in her direction then, as though only just remembering that they were not alone, and lowered his voice. "They'll come for you if you don't come back on your own," he said. "And next time, they won't be asking." Eli held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of something inevitable. "I'll consider it," he said, the same careful phrasing he used for everything that mattered, and the man seemed to accept that as much as he was going to get. He pulled his gloves back on, paused as though he might say more, then thought better of it and turned toward the door. "Don't take too long," he added over his shoulder. "Some things don't wait forever." When the door closed behind him, the room seemed to exhale, and Clara lowered her needle slowly, aware that the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon had been altered in a way that could not be undone. Eli refolded the newspaper with precise movements and set it aside, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, though the silence between them felt different now, no longer empty, but filled with questions that had not yet been asked. It was Eli who broke it, rising from his chair and crossing the room with the same measured pace he brought to everything. "You heard enough to know I wasn't entirely honest," he said, and there was no apology in his tone, only acknowledgement. Clara met his gaze then, steady and unflinching. "You told me what you wanted me to know," she replied. "That isn't the same as lying." Something in his expression shifted at that, not quite surprise, but recognition, as though she had named something accurately that he had expected to remain unspoken. "There's more to it," he said after a moment. "There always is," Clara answered quietly, because she understood that better than most. He studied her then, the way he had from the beginning, with that quiet, deliberate attention that seemed to look past the surface of things and settle somewhere deeper, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its careful distance. "I didn't come here by accident," he said. "I came here because it's the kind of place people don't look too closely." Clara considered that, then nodded once. "And now they are," she said. He followed her meaning easily. "Yes," he replied. Another silence settled, but this one felt less uncertain, as though something essential had been established between them, even if it had not yet been fully understood. That evening, after the lamps had been lit and the other boarders had retreated to their rooms, Clara found herself on the back steps, the cool air settling around her in a way that sharpened her thoughts rather than quieted them, and she heard his footsteps before she saw him, the same steady, unhurried pace that had become familiar in the days since his arrival. He stopped beside her, not too close, and looked out into the darkness beyond the yard. "You should know," he said after a moment. "If I leave, it won't be because of you." Clara let that sit for a moment, turning it over in her mind the way she did with anything that mattered. "And if you stay?" she asked. He was quiet, and when he answered, there was something in his voice she had not heard before, something less guarded, more certain. "Then it will be," he said. Clara did not respond immediately, but she felt the truth of that settle somewhere deep and unexpected, and for the first time since stepping off that train with a future that had dissolved before it began, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that what had replaced it, this quiet, complicated, not entirely honest man standing beside her in the dark, might be something she had not planned for, but not something she would choose to refuse. The truth, Clara realized, is that a man does not spend his life running from something unless it matters enough to catch him eventually. And when it finally does, the only question left is what he is willing to lose to keep running. And she saw the answer in Eli Carter before he ever spoke it aloud. In the way he stood a little straighter the morning the riders came back. In the way the quiet carefulness that had defined him shifted into something more resolved, as though a decision long delayed had finally found its moment. They arrived just after sunrise, 3 of them this time. Their horses too well kept for ordinary work, and their presence too deliberate to be mistaken for anything but purpose. And the town, which had learned to mind its own business, watched without appearing to watch as they rode straight to the boarding house and dismounted with the confidence of men who expected to be received. Clara was in the kitchen when the knock came, and she knew, without needing to be told, that whatever had followed Eli to Red Mesa had finally caught up with him. Martha answered the door, her expression unreadable as always, and a moment later Eli stepped into the front room, not hurried, not reluctant, simply present in the way he always was, though Clara could see, even from where she stood, that something in him had settled into place. The men spoke quietly at first, too low for the words to carry, but tone has a way of traveling even when language does not, and Clara heard enough in it to understand that this was not a conversation between equals, not anymore. "It's time," one of the riders said eventually, his voice firm but not unkind, as though he believed he was offering something reasonable. "You've had your distance. You've made your point. But this doesn't end with you disappearing into a place like this." Eli's gaze flickered, just briefly, toward the kitchen doorway where Clara stood half-shadowed by the frame, and then returned to the men before him. "Everything ends somewhere," he said, and there was no defiance in it, only fact. "This is where I chose." The man shook his head slightly. "You don't get to choose something smaller just because it's easier," he said. "There's too much tied to your name. Too many people waiting on what you decide next." A silence followed, and Clara felt, rather than saw, the weight of what was being offered: land, power, a future secured not by chance but by inheritance. And she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was the life she had once crossed miles of open country to find, the one that had been promised to her in careful handwriting and then taken away before it could begin. And now it stood in front of her again, not as a promise, but as a choice. Eli turned then, fully this time, his attention settling on her with that same quiet steadiness that had first unsettled her days ago, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow until there was nothing in it but the space between them. "You should hear this," he said, not to the man, but to her, and there was something in his voice that made it clear this mattered more than anything that had come before. Clara stepped forward, not because she had been invited, but because she had already decided she would not stand apart from something that concerned her so directly. "There's nothing I need to hear that changes what this is," she said, her voice calm, though she could feel the weight of the moment pressing in around her. Eli studied her for a long second, as though measuring the truth of that, then nodded once, accepting it. "They want me to come back," he said plainly. "Take my place. Sign what needs signing. Be what I was before I left." He paused, and when he continued, his voice softened, not with uncertainty, but with something closer to honesty than she had heard yet. "And I can. It would be the easier path, in most ways that matter to most people." Clara held his gaze. "But not to you," she said, a faint shift at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but something like acknowledgement. "Not to me," he agreed. The men exchanged a look, impatience beginning to edge into their composure. "This isn't just about you," one of them said. "There are obligations. There are always obligations," Eli interrupted, not sharply, but with a finality that closed the space for argument. "The question is which ones I'm willing to keep." He let that settle, then turned back to Clara, and whatever he had been holding in reserve since the day he arrived seemed, finally, to rest in the open. "If I go with them," he said, "you come into that world with me. Whether you want it or not, it becomes part of your life. Everything that comes with it. The land, the expectations, the people who see you not for who you are, but for where you stand." He paused, searching her face not for an answer, but for understanding. "And if I stay," he continued, "it's here. It's smaller, harder in some ways, but it's honest. And it's mine because I chose it, not because I was born into it." Clara listened without interrupting, her thoughts moving not in confusion, but in a quiet, steady alignment that felt less like decision and more like recognition. She had already lived the life where she waited for something promised to arrive. She had already learned what it meant to build a future on words that never intended to hold. What stood before her now was not a promise, but a man offering truth without ornament, and she found, to her own surprise, that it was enough. "You asked me once," she said slowly, "what I would choose if I had the option." Eli's expression shifted slightly, recalling the moment. "I did," he said. She nodded. "I choose what stays," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled into the room with quiet certainty, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Eli exhaled, not heavily, but with the subtle release of someone who had been holding something longer than he realized, and he turned back to the men waiting by the door. "You have your answer," he said. They did not argue, not really. Perhaps they saw in his face what Clara had already seen, that this was not a decision open to persuasion, not anymore. And after a brief exchange that carried more resignation than frustration, they left the way they had come, their horses' hooves fading into the distance until the town returned to its ordinary quiet. The boarding house settled around them, the moment passing not with drama, but with a kind of stillness that felt, in its own way, more significant. Eli remained where he stood for a moment, then looked back at Clara, and there was something different in his expression now, not relief exactly, but clarity, as though the path ahead, however uncertain, had finally come into view. "That wasn't the easier choice," she said. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." A pause, then, softer, but it was the right one. Clara considered him for a moment. This man who had arrived with nothing and turned out to have everything, and then had chosen, deliberately, to keep only what could not be taken from him. "Then we should get back to work," she said, because life, she had learned, does not pause to admire decisions, no matter how important they feel in the moment. Something in his expression warmed at that, subtle but unmistakable, and he nodded. "Yes," he said, "we should." And so they did. The days that followed did not transform overnight into something grand or extraordinary. The roof still needed mending. The woodpile still needed cutting. The future, such as it was, remained unwritten and uncertain. But it was theirs, built not on promises sent from a distance, but on choices made in full view of what they required. By the time spring began to soften the edges of Red Mesa, there was talk, quiet, unconfirmed, but persistent, of land just beyond the edge of town, modest but workable, and of a man and a woman who had begun, without announcement, to shape something there that looked very much like a life. Clara stood one morning on the small stretch of ground that would become theirs, the early light catching in the dry grass, and felt, not for the first time, that the future she had once imagined had not been taken from her after all, but redirected, stripped of its illusions, and returned to her in a form she could finally trust. Eli came to stand beside her, his presence as steady as it had been from the beginning, and when his hand found hers, it did so without hesitation, as though it had always known where it belonged. "It's not much," he said, looking out over the land. Clara shook her head slightly, her gaze following the line of the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise. "It's enough," she replied. And this time, there was no uncertainty in it at all.